Welcome, everyone, to History Gone Wilder, part of Half History Will Travel. I'm your host, the Wilder historian, Dr. Lucas Wilder, and I just wrapped up the biography on John A. Logan. The Patreon members voted for me to cover George Pickett for the next biography series. If you'd like to vote on the next general to be covered, please join the Patreon page for as little as $1, and you can cast your ballot. If you like what I do, please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already, join the Patreon page, and purchase something from one of my online stores. Every little bit helps. Thank you. The afternoon of July 3rd, 1863, defined and brought to a climax the largest battle on the North American continent. It also defined one man's life in particular. George Pickett, along with other division commanders from James Longstreet and A.P. Hill's respective corps, advanced on the Union position on Cemetery Ridge, outside the little Pennsylvania town of Gettysburg. The attack, known as Pickett's Charge, bears George's name, though he was by far not the only one involved. Pickett's Charge has come to define George Pickett and brought his name immortality, though he failed in the attack. It was the last great gasp of the Army of Northern Virginia during its second invasion of the North, and became known as the high water mark of the Confederacy. Through a hail of lead and iron and an effusion of blood, George Pickett's name lives on in the history books and brings people from all over the world to the fields over which his division of Virginians marched toward immortality. George Pickett was born on January 25, 1825 in Virginia. His family immigrated to what would become the United States in the 1600s, and by the time George was born, settled outside of Richmond, Virginia. Virginia was a tumultuous place in the early 1800s. The constantly cultivated plantations and farms on the eastern side of Virginia produced fewer and fewer crops. Soil depletion wreaked havoc on farmers and planters alike. George's father, Robert Pickett, was faced with a decision regarding making a living. He could try to eke out a living in Virginia or move west where some of his family traveled to, but Robert decided against a move. With his farm not yielding what he hoped, his investment in slaves became a burden, so he got rid of over half of them, entered into the coal business, and began to rent out his property in Richmond to gain additional income. That was the world George was born into. The young man was talkative and boisterous, with a ready laugh and a melodious voice. He loved to hunt, sing, and dance. His mother Mary called him indolent, and he certainly was, preferring play over work. Warned by poor health and the premature death of 5 other children, Mary became apprehensive about these perceived flaws in her son's character. She fretted over his lack of self-reliance and discipline, direction and ambition. She wondered if he would ever mature into a respectable gentleman. To attempt to shape George into an upstanding gentleman, the family sent him to Richmond Academy, but his time there only lasted 2 years. His family could no longer afford the high tuition. Additionally, George disrupted classes and reveled in pulling pranks. He always looked for a way to overcome his restlessness, and it usually resulted in disobedient and disrespectful behavior. In 1839, Mary and Robert decided to send George to live with Mary's brother, Andrew Johnston, who had earlier moved to Quincy, Illinois. Andrew quickly became a prominent citizen in Quincy, joining a local law firm, serving as the treasurer of the town, and joining the Whig Party. Mary and Robert hoped that the enterprising Andrew would influence George to become an upstanding gentleman. In Illinois, Pickett behaved exactly like he had in Virginia, dancing, hunting, and smoking. He even joined a local theater group. His uncle brought him into the law firm to study law and hopefully pass the bar, but Pickett showed little interest in the law. In 1840, seeing no great change in their son, Robert and Mary suggested George should enter West Point Military Academy. Both Robert and Andrew were officers in their local militias. They viewed the military as an opportunity for George to structure his life accordingly. To get into West Point, he needed a congressman to appoint him. Andrew's newspaper supported the Whig politician John T. Stuart, the law partner of Abraham Lincoln. Andrew's influence allowed for him to ask Stuart to nominate his nephew to the academy. In the summer of 1842, George completed his entrance exam, signaling that although he lacked obedience in school, he learned enough to be competent in the subjects that West Point tested appointees on before entering the school. Within 3 days of him entering the academy, Pickett accumulated 3 demerits, foreshadowing his less than spectacular record at West Point. He would average 165 demerits each year. Those demerits came from various things like late for roll call, using profane language, marching out of step, being improperly dressed, and visiting after hours. Pickett frequented Benny Haven's temptingly close tavern. He loved alcohol, and as one of his classmates declared, Pickett was a devoted and constant patron of Benny Haven's. On one occasion, another classmate found Pickett drunk and lying in a snowdrift. The classmate saved Pickett from frostbite and possibly expulsion by rescuing him from the elements. At the end of his first year, he stood 218th out of the entire student body of 223. His academics wouldn't improve. In 1846, he graduated 59th out of his class of 59, dead last. Those in his class included George B. McClellan, George Stoneman, Thomas Stonewall Jackson, Dabney H. Maury, Darius Couch, Cadmus Wilcox, Jesse Reno, and David R. Jones, to name a few. Pickett wouldn't be able to get a position in the engineers or the artillery with his low standing. He preferred to go into the dragoons, and one of his aunts even wrote to the Secretary of War that her nephew would be more fit for the dragoons because of his horsemanship. The letter didn't make a bit of difference. He was going into the infantry. The Mexican-American War erupted the same year as Pickett's graduation. General Zachary Taylor led an army into Mexico, and the West Point cadets in the class of 1846 were anxious to get to the front, hoping to win glory for themselves. The summer furlough began after graduation, and Pickett went back to his family in Virginia to await his orders. When July came and he had yet to receive his orders, he got worried. Then he found in a newspaper that he had been assigned to the 8th U.S. Infantry. Now he panicked. He hadn't received the official word from the War Department and hadn't been given instructions as to where to meet his new command. All those papers were sent to Quincy, Illinois, the location of his appointment to West Point. The matter was settled eventually, and Pickett got the information he needed. He set off for Matamoros, Mexico, but broken steamers, low water levels, and other obstacles delayed him. He arrived on November 9, 1849, 2 months late. His commanding officer requested a written explanation for his tardiness. Pickett missed the important battles in northern Mexico, but another opportunity arose for this recent graduate. President James K. Polk agreed for General Winfield Scott to land an army at Veracruz, an important Mexican port, and strike for the Mexican capital. Pickett would be transferred to Scott's army, but he found military life dull. He spent his days drilling new recruits, a monotonous and difficult job, breeding contempt for volunteers. Pickett was assigned to William J. Worth's division and arrived at Veracruz to help bring the city into American hands. His unit was also part of the first troops to enter into the city of Veracruz after its capitulation. The army pressed on to Jalapa. Along the road, they fought the Battle of Cerro Gordo, and then pressed on to Puebla to take a 3-month rest while waiting for reinforcements. Compared to active campaigning, the respite at Puebla must have seemed monotonous to Pickett. However, he still found time and money to have a good time. West Point classmate William Gardner remembered meeting Pickett on the streets of Puebla one afternoon in May 1847. Combat had not diminished Pickett's love for a good time and a stiff drink. He revealed a 50-cent piece and invited Gardner to join him for a mint julep at a nearby bar. Thirsty and empty-handed officers quickly surrounded the two men when they entered the bar. Gardner admitted that he felt guilty, realizing that juleps cost 25 cents each. In a moment that recalled his days on the Quincy stage, Pickett rapped for attention and loudly announced, "Fellows, I have asked Gardner to take a drink, and I am simply bound to have one myself. Now, if anyone can squeeze any more liquor out of that coin," he declared, throwing the 50-cent piece on the table, "let him step up and imbibe." The two men drank unmolested by the crowd of onlookers. In August 1847, the reinforcements arrived and the army began to move again toward Mexico City. At the Battle of Contreras, Pickett took little part in the engagement, but he and the rest of his comrades cut a path through the lava beds in pursuit of the Mexican army who were defeated at the battle. At the Battle of Churubusco, Pickett had one of his hardest battles thus far and his most standout performance. The Americans repeatedly attacked a fort that guarded the Churubusco River. The Americans attacked piecemeal for about 3 hours until a concerted effort to take the fort started in motion, with Pickett's 8th U.S. Infantry supporting the 6th in the attack. The men, without scaling ladders, charged across a 20-foot wide water-filled ditch to the 15 high-foot walls. The 8th was the first to plant their colors on the ramparts of the fort. Pickett's superiors cited him for excellent conduct in the taking of the fort, and he received a brevet promotion to first lieutenant. On September 8, 1847, Pickett participated in the Battle of Molino del Rey, where he was on the American right, taking part in the bloody assaults that yielded little results until American artillery opened up a furious barrage and helped push the Mexicans away from the area. Again, Pickett was cited for his abilities on the field. A few days later, Scott planned to assault the fortified castle of Chapultepec. Scaling ladders and courage drove the Americans up against its fortified walls and entrenchments. As Pickett himself maneuvered up the dangerous ground, another West Pointer, not too far removed from the academy, named James Longstreet, was carrying the American flag. Longstreet went down with a wound to his leg. Pickett grabbed the flag and with one arm climbed the ramparts and pushed on into the fortified area, aiming for the flagpole. He tore down the Mexican flag and replaced it with Old Glory. He would receive another brevet promotion for his actions at Chapultepec. As one of Pickett's biographers explained, to young officers like Pickett, war in Mexico meant male companionship, conquering a dishonorable and inferior enemy, and gaining recognition from comrades and officers. It meant frontal charges and flanking attacks that always succeeded, and daring feats that always brought glory. For George Pickett, the Mexican War was raising that flag over Chapultepec. In the midst of death and suffering, he had found his life's calling. As Pickett made his way back to the port of Veracruz, he stopped off at Jalapa and brought along his cousin, Henry Heath, also in the army, to have a good time. According to Henry Heath, they painted the town red before leaving. Following the Mexican War, Pickett was stationed for a short time at Jefferson Barracks in Missouri, close to St. Louis. It was there he learned more of his role as an officer in an infantry company and regiment. The barracks could be a little dull, but St. Louis afforded the soldiers a source of entertainment. Pickett also became sick during this time at the barracks, and his father attempted to use his political connections to bring Pickett home to recuperate, but his attempt failed. By the end of 1848, Pickett received his new orders. He would be heading to Texas for duty on the frontier, building roads, escorting civilians through hostile areas, and setting up military installations. In the post-Mexican War political climate, the U.S. government cut the size of the regular army, which meant that the soldiers in the service needed to do extra duty. Pickett traveled all over Texas, visiting various installations like Forts Bliss, Gates, Clark, and Chadbourne. He wrote at Fort Chadbourne, "We manage to exist, but it is scarcely more than an existence." During this stint on the frontier of Texas, Pickett got married. It's uncertain when he began his courtship with the daughter of prominent Virginia planters, but by late 1850, the two set a date for the wedding in late January 1851. Pickett received a 60-day furlough and met Sally in Louisiana, and in the town of Franklin, at the St. Mary's Episcopal Church, they were wed. They honeymooned at the St. Charles Hotel in New Orleans, Louisiana. They probably married in Louisiana because they feared that his leave wouldn't cover the needed time to travel to Virginia. Plus, Sally's sister and brother-in-law lived near Franklin, Louisiana, on a plantation, so she had family in the area. After the honeymoon, Pickett requested an extension to his leave, and husband and wife traveled to Virginia. 6 weeks before his leave came to an end, it appears that he was ready to return to Texas. He wrote to the War Department that if any companies of men were headed to Texas, he was ready to join them. His eager movement back to Texas probably came because Sally was already pregnant, and he knew that if they waited much longer, she wouldn't be able to make the journey, so they decided to leave early, to be able to make it to Texas and settle in. They moved into Fort Gates, but her time there was short. Sally died giving birth on November 13th, 1851. The child didn't survive. Both bodies were shipped back to Richmond to be buried in the Pickett family cemetery. Pickett applied for another furlough to grieve, and although he received the time off, he took an extra few weeks unauthorized leave. During that absence from the Army, he traveled to Virginia. It was on the Virginia shore that Pickett met a little girl, just about 9 years old, named LaSalle Corbell, or more commonly known as Sally. Sally came from a planter family like Pickett, but less well off. She was suffering from whooping cough, and she noticed the officers standing at the shore. She introduced herself, and they struck up a conversation. Pickett told her that he was depressed because he had just lost his wife and child. He told the little girl that his wife's name was Sally, and she was delighted that both of them had the same name. The two built sandcastles, and according to her, he gave her a ring with a gold heart with the inscription Sally on it. By May 1852, Pickett returned to his command, now garrisoning Fort Johnston on a fork of the Concho River. By the end of the year, he moved back to Fort Chadbourne. His time back in Texas was one of misery as he continued to mourn his wife and child, but his family worked tirelessly to get him a promotion. Robert Pickett continued to use his political connections to try and get his son a promotion since the Secretary of War, Jefferson Davis, had been authorized to expand the Army. Robert obtained a letter of recommendation from James Longstreet, one of Pickett's friends from the Mexican War. Longstreet wrote that at Churubusco, Pickett was particularly distinguished as one of the most gallant officers on that field. I was near him throughout the day and can safely say that more conduct and gallantry was not exhibited by an American officer during the Mexican War. Robert continued to get petitions signed by Army officers and letters written by prominent politicians in his battle to get his son a promotion to captain. It worked, and in March 1855, Pickett became a captain in the 9th U.S. Infantry. He was to report to Fort Monroe in Virginia. He didn't arrive until August 1855, but his family was happy to have him within a day's ride of the family plantation. He spent from the time of his arrival until December training new recruits. He now commanded a whole company himself, and when December came, Pickett left Fort Monroe, spent 4 months in Florida, then began the long journey to the Washington Territory by boat around the tip of South America. The territorial governor of the Washington Territory was Isaac I. Stevens. He attempted to get the local Native Americans to sign treaties and be moved to reservations. Thousands of white immigrants descended on the territory and put pressure on resources, and when gold was found at Fort Colville, the flame of war ignited. Native Americans attacked gold seekers on their land, and when a government agent came to investigate the murders, the Yakima cut his throat. When some U.S. Army regulars began to retaliate, they barely escaped with their lives, thus beginning the Yakima War. This was the environment which Pickett entered when he landed on the shores of the Washington Territory. In March, Pickett took part in a fairly large-scale engagement with Native Americans on the White River. The enemy fled and a tenuous peace ensued. Then he and his company moved 100 miles north to Bellingham Bay, where more violence arose between whites and other tribes. When Pickett arrived, he found about 30 settlers crowded into a stockade in a crude fort named Fort Defiance. The soldiers began building a more defensible fort that they named Fort Bellingham, which included a sutler store, barracks, and other necessities for Army life. Pickett claimed military necessity and confiscated 300 acres of land adjacent to the fort. When the couple who owned the land refused to leave, they were forcibly removed from their land. Pickett promised to pay the owner, but the paperwork got bogged down in the War Department, and the residents never received their payment. The monotony of Army life and the allure of nearby gold resulted in a high desertion rate. Between August 1856 and December 1858, over 50 men of his small command deserted. Pickett interacted with Native American groups, even learning their language, in order to communicate with those he dealt with. He even became sensitive to the situation of the Native Americans. One scholar hypothesizes that since many Army officers thought similarly, that this was because many white settlers espoused animosity toward professionally trained soldiers, and that those officers began to look on Indians as someone they needed to protect. Pickett felt this way, not that he saw them as equals to himself, but almost had a paternalistic view of them. Nevertheless, he still dreaded fighting them in combat because of their irregular style of tactics. When a white settler is brutally massacred, Pickett remained supportive of the Indians. Although recommending punishing the guilty tribe, he noted that among Puget Sound Indians, great dissatisfaction is rising in the fact that their land is being continually occupied by the whites and no remuneration or attempt at it. He criticized the insecurity of white settlers of the Sound toward any inroads made by northern tribes. Some Whatcom residents accused him of overstepping his bounds by using soldiers to police civilians and by attempting to shield Indians from what he deemed as white exploitation. Although the details are uncertain, Pickett had a relationship with a Native American woman named Morning Mist. Since her group was the reason that Pickett was ordered to the territory because of their attacks on white civilians, it's believed they came together to help stabilize the relationship between the two groups, but Pickett most likely just wanted female companionship. It's not believed they were legally married by Euro-American tradition, although some insist they did. But it is thought They were married in the Native American tradition. They lived together, and in December 1857, Morning Mist gave birth to a son they named James Tilton Pickett. Morning Mist passed away soon after giving birth. Pickett gave James to a white family in another county, then he applied for a leave so he could travel back to Virginia, which was granted in June 1858.